Picture this. You're trapped on a wooden vessel surrounded by nothing but freezing ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. The temperature has dropped below zero. Ice forms on your beard with each breath. Your fingers are numb. Your body screams for warmth. And here's the terrifying part. You cannot light a fire. One spark, one flame, and your ship becomes your funeral pyre in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. This wasn't a nightmare. This was reality for Viking sailors who conquered the most brutal seas on Earth, without ever striking a match. Today, we're diving into one of history's most baffling survival mysteries. How did the Vikings survive months-long voyages across frozen waters when lighting a fire meant certain death? The answer will challenge everything you think you know about human survival. The year is 985 AD. Eric the Red stands at the helm of his longship, leading a fleet of 25 vessels carrying over 500 people. His destination? Greenland, a voyage of roughly 900 miles across the most dangerous waters in the North Atlantic. But here's what makes this absolutely insane. His ships are made entirely of wood, rope, and tar. They're essentially floating kindling. And the journey will take weeks, possibly months, depending on the weather. The crew faces sub-zero temperatures, winds that can freeze exposed skin in minutes, and waves that drench them in ice-cold seawater dozens of times per day. Modern survival experts will tell you that in these conditions, you have perhaps 3 hours before hypothermia kills you. Maybe less if you're wet. So how did Vikings not just survive, but thrive well enough to establish settlements across the North Atlantic? How did they sail from Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, and eventually all the way to North America? The answer isn't one secret trick. It's a complete survival system so sophisticated that it puts modern camping gear to shame. Let's start with the first problem. Fire is humanity's oldest survival tool. It's how we've conquered every environment on Earth. It provides warmth, cooks food, purifies water, and offers psychological comfort in the darkness. The Vikings knew this better than anyone. They were masters of fire technology on land. They could start fires in rain, snow, and wind. They used fire for metalworking, cooking, and heating their longhouses through brutal Scandinavian winters. But at sea, fire was the enemy. Viking longships were engineering marvels, sleek, fast, and capable of navigating both deep oceans and shallow rivers. But they had one critical weakness. They would burn catastrophically if exposed to open flame. Think about it. You're on a vessel coated in pine tar for waterproofing. The sail is made of wool, often treated with fat and oil. The ropes are soaked in tar. The cargo includes food supplies, animal fats, and personal belongings. One cooking fire gone wrong, one lamp knocked over in rough seas, and everyone dies. Not just from the fire itself, but from being stranded hundreds of miles from land in freezing water. So the Vikings made a choice that seems incomprehensible to us. They went without fire entirely. But that created an entirely new problem. The human body is a furnace that constantly burns fuel to generate heat. In normal conditions, we maintain a core temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But when that temperature drops just a few degrees, things get dangerous. Fast. At 95 degrees, you experience mild hypothermia, shivering, confusion, loss of coordination. At 90 degrees, your shivering stops. Not because you're warming up, but because your body is shutting down. At 85 degrees, you lose consciousness. At 80 degrees, you die. And here's the brutal reality. When you're wet, in freezing temperatures, without a heat source, hypothermia can kill you in under an hour. Viking sailors face this threat every single day at sea. They were constantly splashed by ocean spray. Rain and snow were common. The wind cut through everything. And remember, they had no fire to dry off, no fire to warm up, no fire to save them. So how did they survive? The answer begins with the most unlikely of heroes: sheep. We think of wool as just another fabric today. But to the Vikings, wool was nothing short of a miracle material. And they understood its properties better than most modern outdoor enthusiasts. Here's why wool is extraordinary. Unlike cotton, linen, or even many modern synthetic fabrics, wool retains approximately 80% of its insulating properties even when completely soaked. This happens because of wool's unique structure. Each fiber is covered in tiny scales and has a hollow core that traps air. When wool gets wet, the water is absorbed into the fiber itself, not into the air pockets that provide insulation. But the Vikings didn't just use any wool. They developed a special fabric called wadmal, a dense, tightly woven wool cloth that was then fulled or felted through a process of beating and shrinking. The result was a fabric so wind-resistant and water-repellent that it could keep you alive in conditions that would kill someone wearing modern cotton jeans and a hoodie. A Viking sailor's clothing system was sophisticated, starting with a linen undertunic to wick moisture away from the skin, then multiple layers of wool tunics and trousers, then the outer layer of wadmal. The outer cloaks deserve special mention. These weren't fashion statements. They were survival equipment. Made from the thickest wadmal, often left unwashed to retain the natural lanolin oils from sheep's wool. These cloaks could shed water like a duck's back. But clothing was just the beginning. Here's a question that haunts every Viking voyage. How do you sleep on a frozen ship without freezing to death? The answer is both ingenious and slightly disturbing. Vikings used what they called hudfat, literally skin bag. These were sleeping bags made from sealskin, reindeer, hide, or thick leather, often lined with fur on the inside. A sailor would crawl into this bag fully clothed, pull the opening tight around his head, and essentially create a human cocoon. Inside this bag, body heat would be trapped. The leather exterior provided a barrier against wind and moisture from the deck. The fur lining added insulation and absorbed moisture from breath and sweat. But here's where it gets interesting. Vikings didn't sleep alone if they could help it. Groups of men would huddle together, sometimes with 2 or 3 sharing the same sleeping area, their bags pressed against each other. This wasn't just about camaraderie. It was thermodynamics. Multiple bodies generate more heat than one. The men on the outside of the huddle would shield those on the inside from wind and spray. The crew worked in rotating shifts. While half the men rowed or managed the sail, the others could rest below deck. And yes, Viking longships, despite their open appearance, often had removable deck boards that created a lower area, offering at least some protection from the elements. The physical exertion of rowing was itself a survival strategy. When you're hauling on those oars, you're generating tremendous body heat. Vikings understood that staying active was staying alive. But there was still the unavoidable problem. You can't work 24 hours a day. Eventually, you have to rest. And when you do, your body temperature drops. Which brings us to one of the most crucial Viking survival strategies. In the frozen North Atlantic, there's a saying that would have made perfect sense to Vikings. If you're wet, you're dead. Wetness is a heat thief. Water conducts heat away from your body 25 times faster than air at the same temperature. Get soaked in freezing conditions, and your survival time drops from hours to minutes. The Vikings understood this instinctively. They developed what we might call the dry doctrine. a set of practices obsessively focused on staying dry or getting dry as quickly as possible. First, they brought spare clothing. Multiple sets of wool garments were stored in waterproof containers made from sealed leather or tightly woven fabric bags coated with fat or wax. When a sailor got drenched, which happened constantly, he wouldn't just shiver and hope for the best. At the first opportunity, he'd change into dry clothing. The wet clothes would be wrung out as thoroughly as possible and stowed, waiting for any chance to dry. But here's the problem. Without fire, how do you dry wet clothes? The answer is surprisingly simple. Body heat and wind. Wet wool garments would be worn under dry outer layers. Your own body heat would gradually dry the wool from the inside out. Or, if the weather permitted, wet items would be spread out on the ship where wind and any available sunlight could evaporate the moisture. Vikings even developed techniques for managing condensation inside their sleeping bags. They'd turn the bags inside out during the day when possible, letting any accumulated moisture evaporate. This obsessive focus on staying dry was the difference between life and death. But even the best clothing and sleeping arrangements couldn't solve every problem. There was still the matter of food. Imagine eating nothing but cold food for weeks or months on end. Not cold leftovers from last night's dinner. Food that was never hot to begin with and never will be. Welcome to Viking sea rations. Without fire, cooking was impossible. So Vikings prepared for voyages by creating provisions that required absolutely no heating. This wasn't just about convenience, it was about survival at sea. The foundation of Viking sea rations was hardtack, a simple mixture of flour, water, and salt, baked into extremely hard, dry biscuits before the voyage. These things were nearly indestructible. They could survive being soaked and dried multiple times. They could last for months without spoiling. Were they delicious? Absolutely not. Sailors often had to soften them in water or beer just to eat them without breaking their teeth. But they provided essential calories and carbohydrates. Then there was dried or smoked fish, cod, herring, salmon, preserved through smoking or air drying before the journey. These fish were so dry and hard that they too could last for months. Vikings would tear off pieces and chew them like jerky. Smoked and dried meat from sheep, pigs, or cattle rounded out the protein offerings. Cheese was another staple. Aged, hard cheeses that wouldn't spoil quickly. These provided protein, fat, and essential calories. Butter might seem like an odd choice for a sea voyage, but Vikings stored it in sealed containers where it would keep for extended periods. The high fat content was crucial. Your body burns significantly more calories trying to stay warm in cold conditions. Vikings needed dense, calorie-rich foods. Dried fruits, nuts, and even honey provided variety and additional nutrients. For hydration, Vikings brought beer and sour whey. These might seem like strange choices, but they understood something crucial. Drinking seawater would kill you faster than thirst. The fermented beverages were safer than plain water, which could spoil during a long voyage. Now, you might be thinking, this diet sounds miserable, and you'd be right. It was monotonous, tough to chew, and offered none of the comfort of a hot meal. But here's what's fascinating. It worked. The high-fat, high-protein content gave Vikings the caloric fuel they needed to generate body heat. The preservation methods meant food remained safe to eat for months. Still, there was a limit to how long anyone could survive on cold rations and freezing conditions. Which is why Vikings developed one more crucial strategy. The truth is, Vikings didn't attempt the impossible. They didn't try to sail non-stop from Norway to Greenland without ever seeing land. Instead, they used a strategy that would make any modern sailor nod in understanding. Planned stopovers. The North Atlantic might seem like an empty expanse of water, but Vikings knew better. They had mapped out a network of islands, the Shetlands, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, that served as stepping stones across the ocean. These weren't just navigational waypoints. They were survival stations. Every few days or weeks, depending on the route, Vikings would make landfall. And when they did, everything changed. On shore, they could finally light fires. Massive fires. Glorious, life-saving fires. Wet clothing and gear would be spread out to dry properly for the first time in days. Cold, cramped sailors could warm themselves thoroughly, letting the heat penetrate deep into their bones. Fresh water could be collected. Hot food could be prepared. Stews, roasted meat, warm bread. The psychological impact of a hot meal after days or weeks of cold rations cannot be overstated. Ships could be inspected and repaired. Tar could be reheated and reapplied to seal any leaks. But perhaps most importantly, these stops prevented the cumulative effects of cold exposure. You can survive being cold for a few days, but weeks of constant cold stress without any chance to properly warm up and recover? That's when serious problems develop. Trench foot, frostbite, weakened immune systems, and eventually death. The island hopping strategy gave Vikings regular opportunities to reset their survival clock. But this raises an interesting question. What about the longest crossings, like the final push to Greenland or the voyage to North America? Those journeys could take weeks without any convenient islands. This is where everything we've discussed comes together. The genius of Viking cold water survival wasn't any single innovation. It was the integration of multiple strategies into one comprehensive system. Superior wool clothing that retained warmth even when wet, combined with waterproof outer layers, sealskin sleeping, bags that trapped body heat, used collectively so men could share warmth, high-calorie, preserved food that required no cooking, but provided essential fuel for the body's furnace, rotating work shifts that kept half the crew active, and generating heat at all times. Obsessive attention to staying dry or getting dry as quickly as possible. Ship designs that, while open to the elements, still provided some shelter through removable deck boards and canvas or hide coverings. Strategic voyage planning that included regular opportunities to make landfall and properly recover. Each element supported the others. The clothing kept you alive long enough to reach the next island. The food gave you energy to row, which generated heat, which bought you more time. The sleeping arrangements preserved warmth during rest periods. The ship design protected you just enough. Remove any one element, and the whole system could collapse. But when everything worked together, Vikings could survive, and did survive, some of the harshest maritime conditions humans have ever faced. Here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Vikings weren't just surviving these voyages. They were thriving. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, they sailed from Scandinavia to Iceland and established a permanent colony there. From Iceland, they reached Greenland. From Greenland, they sailed all the way to North America, 5 centuries before Columbus. These weren't desperate, barely alive refugees crawling onto beaches. These were organized expeditions that brought families, livestock, tools, and supplies to establish permanent settlements in some of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth. The archaeological evidence is clear. Vikings lived in Greenland for nearly 500 years. They built farms, raised cattle and sheep, traded walrus ivory back to Europe, and maintained their culture in temperatures that would make modern winters seem mild. All of this was made possible by their mastery of Cold water survival. But there's a deeper lesson here. The Vikings succeeded not because they were somehow superhuman or impervious to cold. They succeeded because they understood their limitations and developed systems to work within them. They couldn't light fires at sea, so they didn't try to. Instead, they invested everything into preventing the need for fire, superior clothing, better food preservation, smarter voyage planning, and collective survival strategies. They accepted discomfort as the price of survival. Modern people often confuse comfort with necessity. Vikings understood the difference. They prepared exhaustively before voyages because they knew there would be no second chances in the middle of the Atlantic. And perhaps most importantly, they learned from failures. Not every voyage succeeded. Ships were lost. People died. But the survivors analyzed what went wrong, adjusted their strategies, and tried again. So here we are, back where we started, on that freezing ship, surrounded by endless ocean, unable to light a fire. But now you understand. Now you know that the Viking sailor on that ship isn't helpless. He's wearing multiple layers of precisely chosen wool clothing. He's eaten high-fat, preserved food that's fueling his body's heat production. He knows that in a few hours, his shift will end, and he can climb into a sealskin sleeping bag where he'll huddle with his fellow sailors, sharing warmth. He knows that in a few days, they'll make landfall where he can dry his clothes, eat hot food, and properly rest. He knows his ship is designed to handle these seas, that his navigation methods will get him where he needs to go, and that countless Vikings before him have survived the same journey. He's not comfortable. He may never be truly warm until he reaches land. But he's alive. And he'll stay that way. The Vikings conquered the frozen seas not by defeating the cold, but by developing a survival system so complete, so well integrated, that they could endure conditions that would kill most modern people within hours. They remind us that humans are capable of extraordinary adaptation when we combine knowledge, preparation, and the willingness to endure hardship for a greater goal. So the next time you're cold and uncomfortable, remember, somewhere in the North Atlantic 1,000 years ago, Viking sailors were colder and more uncomfortable than you can imagine, and they made it home.